Carr Raymond's family had owned the farmland outside of Bank Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. However, his grandparents had been the last members of the clan to actually reside on the property. One dark night in 1953, there came a storm which appeared over the lake, which served as the main irrigation source for the fields during the dry, hot summers. The clouds had swirled over the waters as if being produced from some unknown source or portal in the sky above. Strange lightning had blasted down into the waters and set it alight with the crackling voltage of some magnificent energy. Whatever was the nature of this discharge, it had poisoned the water itself and turned the land into an uninhabitable wasteland. Carr's grandparents had left the worthless real estate behind and moved into town, bankrupt and embittered. Carr and Dan had been best friends their entire life. It had been a pleasant diversion of their childhood to explore the miles of dead woodland and study the menagerie of oddities which it offered. They had witnessed hornets which grew to the size of their fists, hanging from enormous nests which dangled from long dead rotted trees. They had seen two-headed rattlesnakes whose bodies were ridged coils of thick bone that protruded through the abnormally shaped scales like jagged horns and knobs along their spine. In the caves of the Rocky Hills, there could be found roosts of eyeless bats which would hang suspended by long whip-like tails that fastened to the solid stone with barbs of bone like thorns. It was late August of 1962, and the two men had been finally managed to embolden themselves into fulfilling a lifelong ambition: fishing in Skybreak Lake. They had, over the past 10 years, witnessed the feeding of fish on various insects, which skittered over the water's surface, their suspicious being that anything still existing beneath the water would be as grotesque and mutated as the creatures which they had seen residing in the decimated forest. They parked Carr's pickup by the chained gate of the long-rusted fence which bordered the property. Packing their fishing tackle, they hiked the trail up to the abandoned farmhouse and continued onward to the old barn where Carr had learned that they could acquire a small rowboat left by his father. Upon finding it lying upside down amongst a collection of farm equipment, they carried it with great excitement through the woods to the steep valley where awaited the massive lake. It was early morning, and tendrils of long mist clung to the smooth mirror of water as they pushed off and rode for the center. After impaling their hooks with fat, writhing night crawlers, Dan withdrew a large box of donuts and a silver thermos of coffee from his duffel bag as they ate happily and cast their bobbed lines into the lake. Content with the thrill of adventure as only men escaping the concern for money, the weight of finances, and the burdens of romance can be. Their conversation turned to such topics as women they would most like to sleep with, and plans on building a business which would support them into retirement, just as Dan's bobber disappeared completely beneath the water. Dan launched himself across the boat and snatched the pole just as the line lost all slack and began pulling the drag from the reel with a high-pitched buzz. He began pulling and reeling with breathless euphoria as he found himself in a desperate tug-of-war with the creature which had attached itself to the other end of the line. Carr watched with stunned wonder at first, but perceived the white-knuckled grip and red sweating grimace on his friend's face soon grabbed on to aid in the endeavor. They watched as the line zigzagged through the mist and pulled with both their combined might to hold on to what was assuredly an enormous catch. To their complete amazement, the line held as they caught their first glimpse of what had taken their bait. The long, undulating form was covered in a dense profusion of long, spiky prongs which would fan out at their tip like quickly blooming dark green flowers. Each time one of these appendages opened, it sprayed an algae green musky cloud of spores like dust into the air. "Hold it!" Carr shouted, as he rummaged through his own pack for a pair of work gloves, which he slipped on before reaching over the side of the boat and grabbing the bizarre fish by one of its throbbing gill slits. Once he had it in the boat, he hastily tossed it onto the white bucket and watched with mixed disgust and awe as it thrashed and writhed within. They studied it and determined that at one point in its evolutionary path, it had been a carp. But the savage altering of the toxic waters of its habitation had left it with a hard exoskeleton and the horrid growths which still spewed the grotesque clouds of mist from within the plastic container. The smell of the vapor, they realized, was sweet and floral despite the creature's foul appearance. They rowed back to the shore, coughing and gagging, as the thing's cloudy excrete seemed to coat their mouths and throats with a honey-like mucus. "Let's just throw it back," Dan called over his shoulder as he wearily maneuvered the oar from his side of the boat. "Are you kidding me?" Carr seemed aghast at the idea of releasing what they had so rightly earned. "Once it's dead, we're gonna cut it up and see what its insides look like." Dan nodded as he considered his friend's wisdom. "Yeah, that would be cool." Once on shore, Carr donned his gloves and, reaching in, pulled forth the now motionless monstrosity and held his trophy with a still and contemplative expression. "It's dead," Dan said as he poked the carcass with his gutting knife. "As a doorknob," Carr agreed as he carefully laid it down and surveyed its intricate grotesquerie. Withdrawing his own knife, the two went about their absorbing and fascinating dissection. They found the inner physiology of the thing to be as bizarre and incomprehensible as its outer. There were organs and bones, but also strange tangles of spiny hair and networks of rigid black vessels which spewed black oily sputum when they cut it. It was only as they removed what may have been an egg sac that they found the sweet, alluring odor rising from the carcass to be an inciting, a most unexpected effect. They were growing hungry. Dan gazed upon the black, viscous soup which covered the blade of his knife, and as their surgery grew increasingly feverish and intense, splashed droplets onto his pale, whiskered upper lip. Before he even realized what he had done, his betraying tongue had, as if by its own accord, slid from his mouth and tasted it. Nothing had ever been so sweet as a slow, languid warmth spread numbing and delightful over his gums and throat. His eyes widened as his stomach knotted with sudden aching desire to lick more from the steel of his blade. As he contemplated this strange longing, he saw that Carr had already succumbed to the allure of the flesh and was gnawing hungrily on a hardened string of tissue from the creature's side. Dan's hands felt strong and powerful as he grasped the shell of the creature's outer armor and cracked it with divine satisfaction. As the clouds moved in slowly over the surrounding hills, they gorged themselves in an impromptu and hideous feast. When they had finished, neither felt as if any single morsel had been eaten. Their blackened tongues ran over their knives as they greedily sucked at the moistened fingers of their gloves. Their hands were trembling with horrendous need as they gazed around and found only the hard shell and bones of the thing remained. Soon these too were hungrily chewed, and even as they broke their teeth and mauled the soft linings of their mouth with the jagged edges, they longed for more. When all was eaten, they gazed at each other with astonishment, morose sorrow at the absence of more, to nourish their wretched appetite. Blood trickled from the corners of their lips, and in one blinding flash of aggravated madness, they fell on each other, their knives hacked and stabbed as they bit and wrestled each other in the soft grass of the shoreline. Chewing, cutting, screaming, and writhing, they fought until all grew silent in the deep cove of Sky Break Lake. As the clouds broke, rain began to fall cold and cleansing over the torn and ravaged bodies of the two best friends. Wind blew through the broken and lifeless trees as thunder boomed low and dreadful in echoes throughout the valley. As raindrops broke the glass surface of the lake in ripples and infinite intermingling circles, shapes, dark and twisted, began to move beneath. Hundreds of shining black forms, with branchy, blooming outgrowths, amassed in the mire of the muddy shoreline as they began slithering onto the dry land and towards the two bloody heaps of flesh which had been Dan and Carr. From the horrid and repulsive throng, there was a whining insect hum as they gathered and began feasting on the dead fishermen. A being gifted or cursed enough to comprehend the meaning of their conversation would learn that the creatures were pleased celebrants, delighting in the frightening truth that their quarry had taken the bait. He stared at the three blonde-haired little boys as they entertained themselves in the living room. The older two, aged 4 and 5, were immersed in some strange puppet version of It's a Wonderful Life, while the youngest, aged 3, mindlessly doodled with crayons on a scattered piling of coloring books before him. It had been a semi-normal day for Nelson. He had awakened in the late morning to the three blondes gazing at him expectantly in the dark of his bedroom. He told them to go to the kitchen, where he lit a cigarette and pulled on his blue jeans. Nelson knew he was a terrible father, but unfortunately, he was all the three had at the moment. Their mother had bailed and ran off with a cross-country trucker named Biff, Bobby, or Butch, something that began with B. Apparently, Nelson had been a terrible husband as well. It had become glaringly obvious in the months before Mary Jo's departure that she had grown tired of sharing her life and lady parts with a drug dealer. Oddly enough, she hadn't been too particular about ditching her kids with him. It was okay with Nelson. Nelson loved the boys as best he knew how. He just felt sorry for them for having nothing more than a worthless piece of loser trash like himself to raise them. One big problem was that Nelson had no help. His parents were dead, and his sisters had disowned him before he had even graduated high school. So tonight, when the kid called and demanded Nelson show up and deliver his money in person, there was no one to watch Calvin, Kenny, and little Fred. In Nelson's mind, he had no alternative but to lay out some food, tell the boys to be good, and lock the house tight while he headed for a back road in his Trans Am. Also, there was another problem. Nelson didn't have the money. Nelson had always ran a very tight business as far as drug slinging was concerned. He would take whatever profit for himself and return to the kid with his startup to purchase the next batch. Then, over the course of the next few months, he would make out his individual sales to his regular customers, and then the process would begin anew. Only this month, he had gotten lazy. They had told him he could make a bundle in the city. One sale, one night, one huge payoff. Nelson calmly explained that he never sold to gangs. Gangs were bad news. Gangs were unpredictable. However, Thad had assured him that these guys were cool. As it had turned out, they weren't. Fortunately, After they took every dime and every gram he had, they let him go. Coincidentally, that was the same night that Mary Jo left. So here he was, flying down a gravel road at midnight, with his sons locked in a drafty wreck of a house on a cold November night to meet the kid, and explain that he would need a massive front and some time to earn what he owed. It occurred to Nelson that, on top of everything, he was not even a very good drug dealer. He saw the headlights ahead and slowed his car to a stop a few yards back. Nelson fought to still his shaking hands as he pulled the handle on the door and stepped out into the cold, damp wind. He gazed out over the dark, harvested cornfields, which seemed even more deathly and morose in the light of the moon. The kid was leaned back against the hood of his Camaro, toying with a butterfly knife casually as his enormous, redneck goons joked and got high beside him. "It's about time, Nelson. I was beginning to get worried." The kid did not sound the least bit concerned. "Hey, nothing to worry about here, bro. You know me. I'm a straight shooter, kid." "I know that, Nelson. That's why I like you. You're not like the rest of these hillbillies. You have ethics." "That's me, kid. Mr. Ethics. That's why I had so much trouble believing the stories I've been hearing. Like that you got rolled by some gangbangers and now you can't pay me? Ha! I mean, that would just be really stupid, Nelson. I mean, seriously. You know better than that, right?" Nelson gazed at the kid and fought the paralysis that had overtaken his vocal cords. He felt as if his very breathing would betray him should he allow his lungs to expand. That's the thing, kid. Everybody makes mistakes." What happened next was a blinding blur of movement and violence, which left Nelson no time to react. The goons were on him like pouncing wildcats, and before he knew it, he was in the midst of the worst beating he had ever received. Then, as blood spilled over his eyes from a vicious gash in his forehead, he was forced into the trunk of the Camaro, and darkness fell as the door closed. When the door flew open, he gasped as the fresh air hit him and awakened him from unconsciousness. He could see stars through the one eye which was not matted shut with dried gore. Roughly from his prison, by the two chuckling goons, he was taken, and he stared at his surroundings and realized he was at what appeared to be an abandoned clay pit. Once the area had been privy to a number of brick-producing factories, which mined red clay from the soil and created massive chasms in the ground, and the clay was used to create the red fire brick sold nationwide during a time when such material was needed for factory work. Nelson was unfamiliar with the particular site where he had been taken, but seeing the black depths of water below informed him that it had been flooded for years. He was taken to the edge of the enormous fissure and watched as a series of cinder blocks were chained to his ankle. "Come on, kid. Come on. You don't have to do this," Nelson pleaded as he was dragged closer to the edge. "See? That's where you're dead wrong, Nelson," the kid said as he spit to the side and brushed a long strand of greasy red hair from his face. "This is going to happen. And eventually, when your foot rots off and your stinking corpse comes floating up to the surface, people are going to know not to fuck with the kid. That was a lot of money, Nelson. Did you think I was just gonna let the fact that your stupidity cost me $3,000 slide?" Nelson gazed at the face of the 16-year-old boy who was threatening his life and saw for the first time the absolute lack of any human emotion present in the cold, biting stare of the teenage sociopath. Come on, man. My kids are at home, alone in the house." Nelson's voice was breaking as tears began to stream down his cheeks, mixing with the dried blood to create a grisly streaked mask of pink lines through the blonde stubble of his beard. How worthless can you be, Nelson? The kid sneered as the butterfly knife flew out of his pocket, and he deftly flipped the handle, exposing the shining steel blade. You know what's over there beyond that hill, Nelson? That's the old Raymond's farm. You ever heard any stories about that land? Sure I have, kid. Everybody growing up here knows about Skybreak. Well, did you know that when they closed this quarry, they opened up the hill from Skybreak to flood the pit? Nelson studied the smiling adolescent face and tried to gauge where this was headed. They say that the water got poisoned by a meteor or something, and nothing normal could live on the land or in the lake. I've always heard that there were all kinds of strange things living out there in the hills and under the water. Why don't you go find out for me? The kid gave a nod to the lumbering cord-fed monster to his left, and Nelson watched with terror as he lifted the bound concrete blocks and tossed them over the edge effortlessly. The log chain began to unwind with lightning speed, like a snake uncoiling over the rocks into the abyss below. Nelson had no more time to beg as the chain snapped tight on his ankle. Then he crashed to the ground and was dragged towards the precipice. He grabbed blindly as he slid on his belly backwards over the dirt, and his desperate hands found the kid's leg. He indulged himself a moment of satisfaction as he saw fear flash on the boy's freckled, pale face. His legs pulled from beneath him. The kid fell as his two oxen grabbed his arms protectively. Nelson hung over the edge, gripping the kid's ankles as the chain wrenched his foot from the joint, and blinding hot agony shot up his leg. The kid was kicking and yelling, but Nelson held firm as he took one last look into the boy's soulless eyes and said, I'm gonna get you, you little fuck. If anything happens to my boys, I'm gonna see you screaming in hell. That was when the ox planted his boot squarely in Nelson's face, and at last his hands released. The free fall through the cold night air might have lasted an eternity, as still he reached for the rocks and red earth, as he could see jetting before him in a blur, but the heavy pull did not relinquish even for a moment. There was a brief second when he heard the splash of the first block as it broke the surface somewhere below that Nelson had thought he had already met his destination. However, the heavy thud was only a horrifying precursor to the complete and total hysterical eruption of panic as he felt he was consumed by the icy blackness of the bottomless water. He had been screaming throughout the entire duration of his descent, and not one gasp of precious air had been saved for the immersion into liquid night. The weight of the chain continued to drag him sluggishly down into the biting Arctic abyss. Fighting and clawing, he reached until the agony in his chest demanded its vital urge to be answered. Nelson succumbed and filled his lungs with the cold, invading liquid of the quarry lake. There would only be minutes now until life would be suffocated and death realized. There was no way for Nelson to perceive the millions of microbial organisms which hovered attached within every microscopic droplet of the lake which had engulfed him. He could not know that as he was wretchedly gagged and churned, these small, imperceptible organisms were joining and invading the oxygen-deprived cells of his body through every pore of his skin. The life forms pierced every delicate membrane instantaneously as they went about their work of mutating and altering Nelson's very living flesh. Just as the intense pressure in his brain began to close down the dim light of consciousness, Nelson felt the fire. Sudden buzzing electrical warmth began to spread in soothing vitality from one extremity to the other as the fire began to nourish and sustain the last remaining wisp of life within Nelson. Then the fire began to burn. gross darkness within his nearly dead brain, there suddenly, spontaneously, began a rapid fireworks display of flashing bursts of light behind his eyelids. Nelson could not determine whether these were images of thought or after glimmers of perceived light in his retinas, as each explosion corresponded with a new season of intense burning pain within his body. He felt as if he were being crushed, mutilated, dismembered, and electrocuted all at once, as the unseen invasion of microbes attacked and altered every chromosome of his DNA. Gradually, he became aware that he was now hovering, suspended by the blocks which had landed upon some precipice, or perhaps even the bottom of this cold limbo. After a silent eternity as the flashes and agony ceased, he opened his eyes and realized that here, in this lightless, empty world, he could see, and even more shockingly, breathe. He looked out over the submerged wasteland around him and knew that he was not alone, for there seemed to be hundreds of shapes moving and swimming around him, just out of the range of his vision. As he strained to focus on their various sizes and forms, he noticed that he was hearing through the water as well, and what he heard were voices. It seemed as if an entire assembly were gathered and discussing his presence, like some crowd of anxious onlookers curious to view this new visitor in their lightless realm. "He will do well," they whispered excitedly. "We have waited for so long," answered others. "Do you feel his rage, his hate? We are hungry," they chanted in unison. "Bring more," they shouted in his mind. At last he looked down and saw the change which had been wrought onto his body. Every memory he had of what had been himself, every distant cornerstone of what had been his former identity, screamed that he should be horrified by what he saw. Instead, however, he could experience nothing but sublime wonder and surreal excitement at the flowering masterpiece of flesh which he had become. All around him flowed long tendrils of reaching, wondrous appendage, which rippled like vines of pale, boneless skin beneath enormous, white, fin-like wings. His neck had elongated into a serpentine marvel which curled and whipped with effortless strength and marvelous languid grace. If only he could see his face. What beauty had been made of his face? He looked down upon the long stretched claw stilt which was his leg, and viewed what he had thought of as a massive unbreakable shackle only moments before. Now, as his form rippled and flexed, he saw only a thread which one could swipe from one of his many prehensile growths to be severed. Now he was free, as he began to glide and ascend upwards through what now seemed warm and tranquil waters. The three walked back to the car, gazing enthralled at the cadaverous white beauty of the autumn moon. The thrill of what they had just done, mixed with the numerous substances coursing through their bloodstreams, had evoked a high unlike any of them had ever experienced. "We just killed a guy, man!" Bull exclaimed as he smacked his hands together with glee. "Damn! I always wanted to do that." "Yeah, well, he almost took Kid along for the ride," Ashley laughed as he slapped their slender leader on his back sympathetically. "That piece of shit got off easy," the kid sneered as he flipped the knife in his hand with rage. "We should have cut off his balls and force-fed them to him." "Sick, man," Bull chuckled as he stared dumbly at the stars through the swaying leafless branches of the trees around them. "What was he even thinking, man?" Ashley waxed philosophic as he fondly rubbed the muscles of his own arms. "He wasn't thinking," the kid spat as he began to rummage in the ready for his car keys. He watched the two giants begin to fumble clumsily as they squeezed into the car. Bull was immediately opening the cooler in the back seat and withdrawing more bottles of beer as the kid slid in behind the wheel and started the car. "What about his kids?" Ashley said as he removed a small burned glass pipe from where it was stored beneath the seat and examined its contents greedily. The kid looked up wide-eyed as he snatched the pipe from Ashley's grasp and, grabbing a lighter from the dash, inhaled before releasing a cloud of foul chemicals into the car. "That's right. He said his kids were all locked up at home." The kid's hands were shaking, whether from excitement or the drugs, they could not tell. "Maybe we should call family services or something to pick him up," Bull commented as he handed a brown bottle to Ashley. "Are you joking?" the kid said aghast. "This is our chance, man." The kid was searching in his pockets again until he found a small bag of yellow rocks, which he eyed with unnerving intensity. "Our chance to do what?" Ashley asked as he shared an apprehensive glance with Bull. "To pull off some truly evil shit, man." The kid laughed as he struck a flame beneath the glass pipe again. "Come on, kid. We just killed a guy. Let's take it slow," Bull said, realizing that any attempt to appear the voice of reason at this point was futile. Both he and Ashley had heard the kid's evil rants before, and neither was anxious to play a part in another event inspired by the teenager's bizarre ideology. The kid was obsessed with the concept of evil as a tangible force, and believed that he himself was destined to embody this negative energy. He religiously studied historical figures which he deemed worthy of his esteem, and his reading included everything from Mein Kampf to the writings of Marquis de Sade. When sober, the kid could pass as a normal, if somewhat obnoxious, high school student, but the higher he got, the more deranged and fantastic his ramblings became. "Look, Bull," the kid said viciously over his shoulder as he hunched over the pipe like some scavenger guarding a fresh carcass. "If I say we're not done, then we're not done. Come on, kid. You're really high." And maybe, Ashley began as he placed his hand on the kid's shoulder. The kid brushed it off as if it were diseased and stared at Ashley with maniacal, bloodshot eyes. "Maybe what? You better get this through your thick skull, cretin. I'm the fucking Antichrist, and what I say is law, unless you two want to find somebody else to supply you." "Hey, calm down, man." Ashley was holding up his hands as if in surrender. "What you say goes." "That's right," the kid smiled with sickening conceit as he eased back and handed the still smoking pipe to Ashley. He threw the car into gear and slammed his foot down on the accelerator as the Camaro fishtailed onto the gravel and sped down the road like a crimson bullet, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Ashley hit the pipe gingerly as he caught Bull's frozen, uneasy expression in the moonlight. He exhaled and continued this ritual 3 more times, knowing that he would have to be more messed up than he had ever been before to stomach whatever plans the kid had in mind. Calvin, Kenny, and little Fred sat together sleepily on the sofa in their pajamas, watching television with heavy-lidded eyes as they awaited their father's return. It was often noticed by people upon meeting the three that they were astonishingly well-behaved children to have been raised by the likes of Nelson and Mary Jo Kenner. Although often dirty, with uncombed hair and dried mucus smeared under their noses, the three were quiet and obedient children. They were seldom heard crying or complaining, even when they did not get their own way or hurt themselves tumbling around as children do. Unbeknownst to the trio, their next-door neighbor, a Miss Ruthie Mills had been watching the decrepit house ever since their father had left in such a hurry earlier in the evening. Ruthie, being a very knowledgeable and observant woman, was well aware of the fact that the boy's mother had abandoned them, and had grown increasingly concerned as the night wore on, with no sign of Nelson. Finally, as the hour approached midnight, she wrapped herself in a long fur-lined winter coat, and telling her husband her concerns, marched across the lot which divided her property from the crumbling ruin of the Kenner home. Cautiously, climbing onto the warped and splintered boards of the front porch, she began knocking on the front door. She listened carefully and noted the sound of what she guessed to be cartoons behind the wall. She heard the creaking of the floor inside, and watched as the small, old-fashioned mail slot opened and revealed 2 pairs of blue eyes gazing at her tiredly. "Who is it?" It was the voice of the oldest boy, named Calvin. "It's me, Mrs. Mills from next door," she said kindly as she awkwardly bent down to meet the child's gaze. "Oh, hi, Miss Mills." His voice brightened with recognition. "Calvin, where's your daddy?" she said, trying not to sound nonchalant. "He had to go out, but he said he'll be right back." "And he left you here all alone?" She held back the disgust she felt from her tone. "Yeah, but we're big boys," he said. "How long ago was that?" "A while, but I'm not sure. I can't tell time. The little hand was on the 9. "Well, do you boys want to come over and wait at my house?" she said, still smiling as warmly as possible. "I'm not sure," he replied reluctantly. "I made some peanut butter cookies earlier this morning." She hoped that this temptation would prove irresistible, and she was right. No sooner had she mentioned the treat that the sound of the door unlocking greeted her ears. As the door opened, she entered and almost fell back with shock at the sight of the house's putrid, unkempt interior. The floors were strewn with every manner of broken toy and dirty laundry. The sink she saw in the distant kitchen was overloaded with unwashed plates and what appeared to be the crawling, shelled bodies of numerous cockroaches. The boys were sleepily gathering around her as she found their coats hanging from the pegs by the door and their shoes in a line beneath. Grateful she would not have to search through the travesty of housekeeping which was the Kenner home, she helped the boys dress before finding a piece of paper on a stationery on a nearby table and hastily scribbled a note to Nelson. As the group made their way laughing across the lot, they were unaware of the silent eyes which watched them from a large oak tree which towered ancient and foreboding from the back of the Kenner yard. The creature which hung tangled amongst the limbs with its numerous tentacles seemed to ease down into the limbs as if visibly relieved to see the boys being taken to safety. It was only a few moments after the 4 disappeared into the warm little house next door that the creature heard the distant roar of a car motor as it sailed down the back roads and slid sideways as its brakes locked and it ground to a stop in the driveway. The long bristly spines along its back flexed excitedly as its wings trembled with anticipation. It watched with bulbous, pale green, featureless orbs as 3 figures stumbled from the car and approached the house. The creature listened to their familiar voices as the tree branches creaked beneath the pressure of its tightening grip. Its gaze drifted across the sinking roof of the house with its many missing shingles and stopped on the small attic door through which it knew it could gain entry. It heard the intruders pounding at the front door, and in one fluid eruption of motion, launched itself through the night sky, and it flew like a kite of flesh upon the cold night air to land near the attic. It stalked like a mammoth praying mantis and effortlessly ripped away the padlock. Drawing in upon itself, it folded its wings and entered into the small dark room. Seeing in the stale, lightless air, as if it were day, it stared eagerly at the trap door which led down into the house. Ashley and Bull rummaged through the house like two drug-crazed wrecking balls. They upended the couch and tore doors from the kitchen cabinets as they searched for the three boys. Their previous misgivings had now been subdued by the pounding, excited thrill which had replaced whatever inhibitions their conscience may have instilled. The kid had flung a lamp through the screen of the television and was now making his way up the stairs, the blade of his knife shining and ready in his hand. He was only halfway up the steps when suddenly the lights in the house were extinguished, and they stood motionless and surprised in the darkness. "Did you do that?" he called out to his henchman. "Hell no," came Bull's reply, as the kid saw the shadow trip and fall with a heavy thump to the floor over what was most likely an ottoman. The kid stood motionless with one finger held upright in an attempt to silence the other two as he listened closely to the shuffling noises on the ceiling above. "I think they're in the attic," he whispered as he gestured to the other two to come closer. Bull crawled to his feet as Ashley made his way through the darkness to the foot of the staircase. "Go up and get him," the kid ordered as the butterfly knife appeared in his hand once more. "What?" came Ashley's startled reply. "Go up and get them, you moron," the kid hissed as more dragging noises issued from above. The two shared a knowing glance in the shadows as they realized that the Antichrist was wigged out on drugs and too scared to go into the attic to get three small children. They both hoped that this was a sign that their leader was not as apt to enact horrors on the three boys as he had professed. Climbing the stairs, they passed the 16-year-old with smiles barely hidden on their faces. "What the fuck are you grinning about?" The kid held out the blade menacingly, and Bull fell back into his normal submissive stance. "Nothing, kid, nothing." They came to the second-story hallway and stood beneath a small trapdoor which was suspended over the hallway. It was merely a small wooden rectangle with a knotted rope hanging down for a handle. They recognized it as the type that would most likely drop a sliding ladder as soon as it was opened. As they stood, giving each other questioning looks, they could hear more noises above them. Some were soft, fleshy thumps, while others were most definitely drags across the wooden floor. "What are you waiting for?" Whatever minute patience the kid had was now gone, and he was shaking his fist angrily from the stairs, where he still stood only halfway up. Ashley looked at Bull and shrugged his shoulders as he carefully reached up and pulled down the rope. As they had expected, the entrance creaked down on rusty hinges as a dusty, cobwebbed ladder slid out. Bull grabbed the lower rung and extended it to its full length before Ashley tested its strength. Nodding, he began to climb. The attic was a long, narrow cave of stale, musty darkness as Ashley cautiously peeked through the opening. He had expected to see only darkness. It was a surprise when he realized at the end of the room he could see the starlit night through an open square hovering in the blackness. "Hey, the door to the roof is open," he whispered down to Bull. He looked down with a broad grin. "You can tell the kid he's shit out of luck, 'cause I think they got out." Bull was preparing to do just that when he saw the cadaverous, pale shape moving on the ceiling over Ashley's shoulder in the darkness. His impulse was to scream, but horrified fascination held him silent as he saw the long, fish-belly white giant worm slither down and wrap itself around Ashley's neck. Ashley's face immediately turned deep purple as his hands reached for the constricting serpentine vine, which seemed to be tightening effortlessly around his throat. Just as Bull had found the courage to resist fleeing in terror and was reaching to aid his friend, he watched Ashley's entire massive bulk lift up off the ladder and into the darkness of the attic. There were moist, wet sounds, mixed with cracking and stifled grunts as his eyes focused on the bizarre shape he saw moving through the trapdoor. Only then did Bull finally scream as an army of tentacles and claws spewed forth from the attic and attacked him in a frenzy of blurred, wrapping ropes of skin and barbed bone hooks. He had made it to the rail of the landing and was gripping it with all his human strength, but the intense force of the many pulling appendages digging into his flesh and enwrapping his face and legs would not be resisted. The kid watched with wide eyes as he fell back against the wall, and his stare locked with the terrified gaze of his lackey as he screamed for help. Bull had managed to reach out one hand to the kid before he too was pulled from his feet and reeled up through the small portal into the darkness of the room above. The kid's mind was a frozen blank void of ice-cold shock as he attempted to process the details of what he thought could only be an intense drug-induced hallucination. However, the sounds which followed through the tiny trapdoor's opening quickly chipped away at his frail grip on reality. He could hear muted cries and heavy thuds as he imagined Bull being bashed against the attic walls, and as he watched plaster rain and dusty fragments from the ceiling, his resolve and reason shattered. His heart was pounding a dangerous, almost painful drum in his chest as he felt the warm current of urine run down his legs. All rationale was lost as he turned and, stumbling in the darkness over his own feet, tumbled down the stairs. The sharp pain in his now twisted ankle would not slow his hysterical retreat as he limped towards the door and burst through into the cold night. He fell onto the rotted railing of the porch and broke through the warped boards as he fell headlong into the dead shrubs and rolled into the hard frozen ground. His eyes locked on the car as he began first crawling and then desperately limping as fast as his injured leg would carry him to his escape. He had only made it halfway across the lawn when he heard the thunderous crash from behind him and saw the massive shadow pass through the moonlight overhead. He stopped only long enough to witness the horrific majesty of the twisted nightmare as it crashed down onto the roof of the Camaro. For a moment, he stared in awe at the enormous winged thing which had crushed his prized possession, as one might flatten an empty tin can with a booted heel. At first glance, he thought of pictures he had seen in magazines like National Geographic of the bizarre creatures which inhabited the depths of the ocean floor. Its strangely shaped wings undulated like the rippling fins of a manta ray, while a multitude of long tentacles sprang from a vaguely human but somehow insect-like body beneath. Its neck stretched out like that of some pseudopod with only a singular round human skull to hint at its original shape. The bulging empty eyes which stared down at the kid from the sockets of its distorted face were filled with what the kid could only recognize as pure, unrelenting hate. When the grinning, toothy, cadaverous mouth opened, the kid fell to his knees under the bone-splintering, nerve-shattering sound of its shriek. Ruthie had watched the car speed into the Kenner driveway, at first thinking it was a Nelson's familiar Trans Am. She went to the door to call out to her neighbor, but on seeing the three men had halted. She had watched the kitchen window as the three rushed to the house and broke in through the front door. In minutes, her phone was in hand, and she was calling the police. She looked anxiously over her shoulder into the living room where the boys were slumbered, huddled together on the couch before a coffee table littered with cookies and empty glasses of milk. She had heard a sound like a small explosion, followed by a metallic crash and a piercing scream outside. Rushing back to the window, she had squinted out into the darkness, but could see nothing in the dim light of the full November moon. Hastily locking every door, she had returned to her vigil by the window, sipping coffee nervously. She truly hadn't wanted any trouble tonight, but she knew that God would never forgive her if she had let anything happen to three innocent children, no matter how inept and useless their parent. She sighed audibly with relief as she heard the sirens coming down the road. Whatever was occurring across the lot was now in the hands of the Bank Ridge Police Department. The kid had never been one to be overjoyed by the sound of police cars, but this night would be the exception. He almost wept with joy when he saw the familiar flashing blue and red lights speeding down the street towards him. However, this brief hope of salvation sickened as he saw the thing ascend into the darkness and land only a step away as it leaned down and studied him with eyes which gleamed like glass globes filled with putrid, rank water. The kid watched as the bright headlights of the first responders shone upon the horror which towered over him, and he screamed when he saw the bodies of Bull and Ashley coiled lifelessly, cocooned in seething tentacles. As the brakes of the cruiser locked down and the car skidded to a stop on the icy street, the two patrolmen stared in wonder at the sight which greeted them in the Kenner front yard. Officer Hicks gripped the steering wheel with terror as he watched the screaming teenage boy absorbed into the mass of writhing snake-like growths which seethed from the body of the hideous creature. He and his partner, Daryl Ryan, could not utter a word or move to help the doomed boy as they saw the long neck of the thing turn and lock its stare upon them. They then watched as it raised itself upright and fan out its sprawling form as if to show them what it held, wrapped in the ropes of its hundreds of pulsing growths. Hicks began to shake violently, with spasms of horror, as he saw the eyes of the captured boy staring out at them with wide, weeping hysteria beside the forms of two other apparently dead men. Then, as if preparing to pounce, it lowered down onto its vaguely human-like arms before launching itself into the air. Breaking from their paralysis, the two seasoned officers stepped from the vehicle and stared up as they witnessed the thing flying off in the myriad of stars above them. They looked at each other's pale, bloodless faces and asked the silent question of what to do next. Violently shaking and frozen to his core, Hicks returned to the driver's seat and put the car into drive. Daryl's look of wonder turned resolute as Hicks put the car back into gear and set off down the road with sirens blaring. Daryl took a deep breath and steadied his hand as he lifted the radio receiver in his hand and said with a quivering voice, "We're gonna need reinforcements. We're headed out of town towards Skybreak." When asked for details, he only replied, "Unknown assailant has been seen headed in that direction with a teenage boy and two others against their will." He answered no more questions as the car left the asphalt and slammed onto the gravel road which headed to the abandoned building. Rolling down his window, he removed his hat and stared out into the sky where he could see the thing gracefully gliding beneath the full pale moon over the black reaching treetops on the farm. All the years of living in Bank Ridge, growing up there from birth, they had heard the tales of disappearances, the hunters shooting twisted deer, sightings of strange flocks of birds flying out from the ruined farmhouse and barn. Throughout all those years, these stories had been told over coffee in the drugstore and beers at the bar. Now, something undeniably real had appeared and sought prey amongst the people of the town. As they approached the chained gate which led to the property, Hicks was reminded that it was at this very spot that Carr Raymond's pickup had been found some 10 years previous. No sign of he or his friend Dan Worthy had ever been found. Climbing the gate, they drew their guns and walked the path across the darkened property. They had last seen the flying creature as it descended over the lake in the distant remote beyond the hill. With their flashlights guiding the way, they passed the dilapidated Raymond home and soon stood atop the hill, gazing down over the lake. The draining of the lake years ago to flood the clay quarry had left the massive body of water little more than a stagnant, now frozen pool at the bottom of a great barren crater. Staring down into the valley, they saw the creature at the center, clawing and tearing at the ice as it burrowed down into the still soft mud beneath. In a moment, it was gone and all was silent. I can't go down there, Justin," Daryl said as he forced himself to stand his ground and not flee back to the car. "What the hell are we supposed to do then?" Hicks replied. "That boy was still alive. We're cops, remember?" Clouds of steam poured from his mouth with every word as Daryl saw his own panic reflected in his partner's eyes. "What are we going to do, Justin? Shoot it?" he said, holding the pathetic .38 revolver in his hand as if it were a toy. As he spoke these last words, both felt the rumble of the ground beneath their feet as the earth around the hole which the creature had made began to crack and boil. Smoke and light was beginning to pour out from the crevice as the mud began to rise into a cracked hillock of dim blue light and steam. There was no sound as a single ray of energy shone up into the sky, and they watched a whirling pattern of clouds begin to form over their heads. The startling warm breeze was blowing as the sky began to cloud over from a pinpoint of shining light like a dark blue star forming over the lake. The two began to step back with awe as the light increased, as did the accompanying storm around it. The newly formed clouds flashed with lightning and surged with electrical energy. The layer of ice had completely shattered as what appeared to be a strange, translucent sphere of luminescent blue emerged from the earth, like the crowning head of an infant slowly pushed from the womb. At first it looked to be shaped like an egg of pulsating biological material, reminiscent of some spider's woven egg sac, covered in pustules of oozing viscous liquid and vein-like ridges coursing with dark, murky fluids. This object seemed to be rising up the beam of its own radiation towards the now swirling open portal which had opened in the sky. The entire thing seemed to be of a more biological living substance than some constructed technology. The two officers held firm as they felt a vacuum force pulling at them from the direction of the open, swirling pool of light which had opened in the night sky. As the throbbing, living mass of the object began to submerge into the light, the power and intensity of the storm heightened to an almost cataclysmic crescendo of wind, lightning, and turbulence. As the last of the oval-shaped fleshy construct disappeared into the portal which itself had seemingly created, the light began to fade as the hole in the sky seemed to close in upon itself. The winds began to abate as the thunderous strikes of shattering electricity waned. After only a few moments, the patrolmen were alone in the darkness, watching as the last remaining ember flashed from view like a star that had flickered out. Standing cold and awestruck with what they had just witnessed, the two now could hear the sirens of their backup wailing in the distance. Hicks slowly turned to Daryl and, placing his gun back in its holster, spoke. "How long do you think that thing was down there?" "If the stories were true, then it would have been since the late 50s, he answered with a distant, mesmerized tone. "What do you think it wanted with those three men?" He said this as he saw the squad cars parking on the other side of the trees which bordered the fence. Daryl pondered this as he remembered every science fiction movie he had ever seen. Food? Energy? God only knows. What are we gonna say, Higgs? "We followed the perps out here, and we lost them in the woods." "Yeah, that sounds good. We lost them in the woods." As it would turn out, a Trans Am belonging to Nelson Kenner would be found parked within a few miles of the abandoned clay pit nearby. The mystery of his disappearance would coincide with that of three other known local drug dealers, and the entire event would be explained as a drug deal gone bad. The two first responders would report that they had followed a van out to the abandoned Raymond farm known as Skybreak, and stories would emerge that police investigating the area had uncovered a vast burial ground of scattered remains in the dried bed of the area known as Skybreak Lake. It would be suggested that some drug ring had been using the farm and surrounding area as a dumping ground for years, thereby explaining the mass of disappearances near the property over the previous decades. Daryl Ryan and Justin Hicks would never speak again of the events of that night. When asked what they thought may have smashed the Camaro which was found in the driveway of the Kenner house, they would only answer that the owner, a 16-year-old troublemaker named Clifton Hughes, must have rolled it at some point before leaving it damaged before his abduction. Eventually, after being allowed to stay with their neighbor, a kindly Christian woman named Ruthie Mills, the three Kenner boys were collectively shipped off to live with their aunt in far-off Rawls, Ohio. By all accounts, they grew to be fine, outstanding young men with good jobs and loving family. They returned to Bank Ridge once a year for a Christmas dinner with the Mills family, until Ruthie's passing in 2005.